Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. One of the things I'm doing currently is reviewing a book associated with the phone hacker John Draper Crunch. And one of the incidents that I have, not explicitly with Crunch, but one of Crunch's associates, was an individual called Steve Innes. Now, Steve Innes was part of the original Homebrew Computer Club. He was a bit of a misfit, a bit of a miscreant in this general circle, which was already filled by misfits and miscreants. And my interaction with Steve Innes is only very brief. He called me when I lived in Las Vegas, when my wife and I had arrived in Las Vegas. We must have been there only about 4 or 5 months, asking if he could store some of his possessions with me. Now, I had never met Steve Innes previously. I knew nothing about him aside from, well, I knew some stories about him, but I hadn't met him previously. And this was the first time that I'd ever had any communication with him. So when he called and said, "Can I leave some stuff with you?" I said, "Look, Steve, I don't know you." We were in the process of transition anyway, so we were in the process of considering moving and stuff reduction. He didn't have any time frame associated with this stuff being collected. And I thought, historically, I've looked after people's stuff when I've known them for some period of time. But then you get this terrible thing where if the person disappears, I've had this happen previously, eventually you need to get rid of the stuff. If the stuff is any value, you have to probably sell the stuff. And if the stuff isn't of any value, then, you've got to work out what you have to do with this other person's stuff. And I think through this perspective, I said to Steve, "Look, I'm sorry, I don't think I can look after your stuff." And I was the last person within a circle of people who ever spoke to Steve. He was apparently, allegedly, in his telephone call, walking along a desert highway. And, that was the last anyone ever heard from him. Until he appeared in the Wall Street Journal. He was in a Wall Street Journal article that attributed a quote to him. And I emailed the Wall Street Journal journalist to say, "Hey, have you had contact with Steve Innes? Is this quote from him?" Because, I have this crazy story. I don't think I got into much detail. I just wanted to know if they'd gotten the quote from Steve Innes himself. They hadn't. So when I read the John Draper Crunch bio with reference to Steve Innes, there was an additional detail associated with him living in Davis and passing away in 2015. I think it was 2015. And this struck me as really strange. And through some correspondence and Googling, I found that, yes, actually, this was the same Steve Innes who had turned up in Davis in California and who had existed for a period of time working with kids and bicycles and doing various things in the Davis community until he was tragically killed by a train. And most of the correspondence associated with his death through the websites that posted it indicated that he'd probably committed suicide. So here was a person who had a very tangential impact on my life. One fleeting conversation at one particular turning point. And if I'd known the guy a little bit better, I might have looked after his stuff. Who knows? But it always struck me as a kind of poignant discussion that I was the last person to have spoken to this guy. And I assumed he died after this interaction. I assumed that somehow he'd passed away. In fact, I can't recall if I ever filed a missing persons report or if I ever did anything formally with the police, but I was genuinely freaked out about the whole thing. So to hear of his passing, to hear of his good work from the period of time when I spoke to him to when he was ultimately killed by the train, made me feel a little bit better about things. That I hadn't been some callous, anonymous person in this circumstance. That it wasn't the result of my failure to take his stuff that this fellow had passed away. But it was a series of permutations following this, which ultimately led to his passing. It's a curious world we live in. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.